and welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is an award-winning author whose work has shaped the way we read about India and the diaspora. Her debut novel, Hullabaloo in the Guava Orchard, won the Betty Trask Prize. Her second, The Inheritance of Loss, won the 2007 Booker Prize and cemented her reputation as one of literature's most subtle observers of displacement and belonging. Almost 20 years later, she's returned with The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, a sweeping, tender and deeply human story about love, exile, family and what it means to be alone in a crowded world. The work has been shortlisted once again for the Booker Prize. Kiran Desai, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Thank you so much.
It's such an honour for us to have you here, a former Booker winner, and we're recording this before the winner for 2025 is announced. Let's go back, because you were born in New Delhi in 1971 and you came of age during a period of really big political upheaval, the emergency, protests, social change. I wonder what you remember of that atmosphere and how you think it shaped your early sense of story.
That's such a lovely question, such an important question, because I think it shaped my work so much. Now, when I look back at that time of my childhood, I remember vividly the Hindu Sikh riots, for example, in the 1980s, and we were living in a house in a neighborhood where there was a Sikh Gurdwara quite close by, and I remember curfew, I remember the terror of Sikh friends, I remember people being burnt alive in our neighborhood. Can you believe that? And so that profoundly changed me and the way I think I've been returning to that time. But also I was in India at the time of the demolition of the Babri Masjid Mosque. And I remember how terrified everybody was that the violence would spread to Delhi, the Hindu-Muslim riots would spread to Delhi. And then the terror of Muslim friends, you know. And I remember, you know, the filmmaker, the wonderful filmmaker Ismail Merchant, who made a film of my mother's book, In Custody. I remember he called her crying. And, you know, those things you never forget. And when I was writing perhaps my last book, but this book as well, those communal tensions in India and what it means to be a minority have always been at the center of my thinking, because I, meanwhile, of course, I'm in a minority in the United States. And although it's a ridiculous thing, as one of the characters says in The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, to call yourself a minority when you come from a people who number well over 1 billion. But the conversations around minority rights, human rights, have therefore always been important to me. And it has broken my heart to see what has happened in India since then. And in The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, one of the lonelinesses really, and one of the things I wanted to talk about, is that fear of minorities in India and in the States. But I went back to that time and really tried to speak about political loneliness.
You mentioned a film of your mother's book because, of course, your mother is the novelist Anita Desai. Was that very clear to you as a kid? Were you thinking we're living with this amazing writer, or was she just mum? I mean, how did it influence the household where writing was the family business?
She was just mum in some way, but an unusual mum. Always felt like an unusual mum and different from the other mums in the neighborhood, because I grew up with her bookshelf and her writing discipline. You know, I don't know how she developed that in a world where she had really very little company. I remember she was close friends with Ruth Pravar Jhabwala because she'd grown up next door to Ruth, who lived in Old Delhi. They both lived in the same neighborhood. And she credits her with sort of providing her with an example of what it was to be a writer. But then she really had no company. She was married with 4 children, and yet she had an extraordinary taste, which she says comes from having German mother and an Indian father from Bengal. And she says that she always had this, both a European eye and an Indian one, And I grew up with those bookshelves, the bookshelves that encompassed both those worlds.
And there must have been a lot of people around too who were exciting. I mean, was she visited by other writers, by publishers?
Eventually, I think that's how we understood as children, her growing fame, because her publishers would come from around the world and stay with us in Delhi, and her translators would come. And I think the world just gradually grew bigger that way. She went on her first foreign trips as a writer to France and to Scandinavia. So I remember those exotic visitors from overseas. And then I think the door just opened for her. And she was invited to be a writer in residence at Girton College in Cambridge. And she left India at that time, although she was still going back and forth for many years. But that was when I think she started teaching abroad. She went from Girton to teach in the United States. And I was the youngest child, so she took me with her.
I mean, that's really interesting because you've lived in India, you've lived in England, you've lived in the US, a citizen of so many worlds. And you've written sometimes about long periods of solitude and that somehow you didn't think of yourself as a person from somewhere. So I wonder about your sense of belonging. Where is home?
Less and less I have a sense of belonging, actually, which is strange. I thought, the longer I live in the United States, I expected to feel more and more at home there. But in fact, the politics unfolding makes me feel quite nervous of venturing out of my little neighborhood in New York. And another thing that surprised me was that I thought I would lose India and that I would grow more and more distant. And in a way I have. But emotionally, we were talking earlier about those political moments, and I find that my heart just broke. I feel heartbroken to see the attacks on minorities in India right now. And so emotionally, I've sort of swerved back to thinking about India and, speaking out on occasion or helping people who are in trouble, but just thinking of not only speaking out in terms of human rights, in terms of rights of Christians, Muslims, Sikhs in India, but also, fighting for a literary landscape, which is a landscape I owe so much to, of being able to, and I just think of people, we mentioned Ismail Merchant, but I think of Salman Rushdie, or I think of the painter M.F. Hussain, or I think of the musician Zakir Hussain, and I think of the extraordinary luck of having grown up in a country where there were people of so many different religions and cultures mingling, and that you could actually write with intimacy, affection, and knowledge of these different communities and philosophies, and how much I owe to that mix. And you could argue I owe the United States I have a similar debt because of that extraordinary mix in the United States. So I feel like we're also fighting for a literary landscape there.
Mm-hmm. Except now in the United States, I mean, can that feel like home? It feels certainly to us looking in that people like you are being absolutely discriminated against.
Yes, I think it's come as a shock to the Indian community, many of whom actually supported Donald Trump, to see this turning against immigrants in general, but India in particular right now. And I live in a very immigrant neighborhood of Jackson Heights in Queens, where it's a mix of Hispanic and Asian, so people from Uruguay and Colombia and Peru and Venezuela, and also Nepal, Tibet, Bangladesh. It's quite fascinating because, we're all divided in South Asia, but in this neighborhood, we're all living together like the way we should have been all along. It's Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Tibet, India. It's really quite extraordinary. But recently, there's been real fear in the neighborhood, and ICE agents are around, and there was a very vibrant life under the subway tracks of taco stands and arepas being sold and trinkets, and all of that is gone. And I know from India that once fear enters the conversation, fear enters a country, that's the beginning of the end. Yeah. When people are too scared to speak up and people are terrified.
You speak of this vibrant community, but I wonder how much you actually have to do with it on a day-by-day basis, because listening to you talk in other places and reading you, this book has taken nearly 20 years, and it seems very clear to me that it's been quite a solitary experience for you writing the book. How much were you engaged with life beyond this novel?
I did transfer my existence into this book. I really didn't have much of a life outside this book, and I was working on it every single day. However, it is also true that when I moved to this neighborhood, the first night the windows were open, and this incredibly sweet conversation of this Bengali in Bengali fell into my window, and I thought, oh, how fascinating it is to be able to listen into different worlds. And 2 doors from me, there was an old Coptic Christian man from Alexandria in his 90s. And sometimes I would go across and drink coffee under his fig tree. He would give me figs and tell me about his childhood in Alexandria and how his father was fighting the British Army and got stranded in Bombay. Another neighbor is a Tibetan family. They were sponsored by a synagogue to come over to the United States. So, yeah, while I was solitary, I was still, going out and having little chats around the neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, nearly 20 years. You once said that by 2013 your notes were over 5,000 pages. I mean, that's a lifetime's worth of sentences. I wonder if you know when to stop, or how did you know when the book had found its shape? And did you think that you might never finish?
Yes, I thought I might never finish because I was actually quite happy working on this book over and over and over again. And I didn't tire of it, which is quite strange. And because of the way it's structured, sort of trying to follow different kinds of lonelinesses around the world, thinking of it almost as a form of water, morphing shape, and a lot of water images in this book. And, looking at the beautiful aspects of it as well as the painful, I could have gone on forever in a way, but I read those 5,000 pages and got a glimpse of how I could structure the story around Sonia and Sunny. And there's a central scene of where they meet in a train, and it takes place, I think, 250 pages or so into the book. But once I had that, I thought I had the center.
Because you don't plot out in advance.
No, and I so envy the writers who do, who know in advance or write swiftly through the whole story and then perhaps fill it out or know the ending before they begin. So envious of those authors. No, it comes to me gradually, and I think, it became a very strange creature, this book, and I would catch a glimpse. I had that scene in the train, but otherwise, for a long period of time, I was just catch a glimpse here and a glimpse there. And when I was reading those 5,000 pages, I was looking for where the manuscript came alive. Just any glimpse of life and vibrancy or something interesting, unusual. So it was almost like there was a strange creature swimming there in these 5,000. And I would get a little glimpse of a fin or a tail here and there and try to put it together.
So you've talked about how you envy people who do sort of can see this great big overview. I wonder how your writing process differs from your mother's, who I know is your first reader, and if your relationship with her has morphed more away from that mother-daughter relationship into sort of, almost colleagues or mentoring.
She thinks she writes very differently. And I think she almost feels a bit of pity for the way for the way I write, because she has said a few things about how the computer makes a writer think that she can rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, and that is actually a complete disaster. It's a curse. It seems like something wonderful that you can go on and on and on and save every version of a scene, but it's also a curse. And she doesn't do that. She thinks a lot before she even begins to work. A lot of it goes on in her mind. And she writes a very clean manuscript in her tiny handwriting. And then she types it herself into her typewriter. And I remember, the early photographs of her as a very beautiful young writer with her hair up in a big bun in her sari and sitting at her typewriter typing. Then if she makes any changes at all, she types out, the sentence, and then she cuts and pastes it with glue onto the manuscript.
That's extraordinary, quite extraordinary. When you won the Booker in 2007, did you need this time out of the spotlight just to kind of process that, or to give you space to think? How did it affect your writing?
It definitely gave me confidence and a feeling of some legitimacy, because it was my second book and I was still quite young.
The youngest Booker Prize winner ever, in fact, I think.
At that time, but there's always a younger one. What with the oldest one? But at the same time, I suppose I was overwhelmed and having to learn to be out in the world speaking about my book. And perhaps I was self-conscious, and self-consciousness is never a good thing for a writer. You need to vanish into your work. And of course, the literary world in New York also makes one self-conscious. So another reason I moved into this neighborhood was just to step away from that. And it definitely helped to take so long and to vanish into my work and not to be in that world so much anymore.
I mean, does that, because the book itself, the new book, The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, is very much, there's a lot of loneliness in there. And I'm wondering if you were feeling that, and if loneliness becomes part of the creative force.
When Edna O'Brien died, I went back and read some Edna O'Brien stories, and I was watching her on YouTube, feeling a bit of a pang at her loss. And she has such a beautiful voice. And she said, I think a writer must be lonely or has to be lonely, something like that. Because why else would you spend all of this time at your desk? If you had a full and busy life, there's something that drives you to retreat and work. So, I always had a feeling of loneliness, even when I was living in India, by the way, in a household full of children and a busy country, busy life. I still retreated to the world of books, and somehow we were reading as if we were in exile. I think India felt so far away from the rest of the world at that time. It had not opened its doors to join the big market. That happened in the late 1980s when India drastically changed at that moment. But when I was growing up, it was without television and without really even films coming from abroad, and the only way the world arrived was through books. And then I was, of course, a foreign student and an immigrant, and both things result in a feeling of being lonely in some way, and painful loneliness of being away from India and family, but also learning artistic loneliness at that moment, writing my first stories, sort of exquisite happiness at being alone. So those two things.
You mentioned family, and particularly the older generation frames so much of this story. There's such tenderness. There's also, I suppose, there's also quiet tyranny in parental love. Were you thinking about generational inheritance, about what gets passed down, whether we like it or not?
Very much. And I wanted to write that arc from the grandparents' time, Sonia and Sunny's grandparents' time. So grandparents who were born in British India and lived through independence movement, and parents who lived through the time of partition and into our modern world. It was important for me to see how all those different stories and journeys affected Sonia and Sunny's, but also how the different love stories affected their love story. And the grandparents who would have married when they were children, really, like my father's parents did. And, I think one of the characters observes of them that they would never have bothered with the word love at all. They were rooted somewhere far deeper and more elemental. Would never have occurred to them to part company. But Sonia's parents do, for example. So different ideas of love and how Sonia and Sunny absorbed them.
You've said that you wanted to write a present-day romance with an old-fashioned beauty. I wonder what that means to you. Did that old-fashioned ideal survive the modern world that you created for them?
I wonder if old-fashioned I just meant long. I was definitely thinking of Anna Karenina, and there too, it's not just one couple. There are all these other stories that influence them. But I was reading Snow Country by Kawa Bhatta, which I love, and Kundera, and all these other, Marquez. And I think one of the reasons a writer writes is just to place a book on the shelf alongside books that she loves. And that was definitely one of the inspirations. I wanted to have a book on that shelf. And I think the other thing I was thinking, which seems transgressive, is that, we actually read for pleasure, which is something I think we've forgotten in the modern day. When I say an old-fashioned beauty, now often books are spoken about in terms of educate. We seek them out to educate ourselves, to understand the world. And sometimes I just feel like I might as well just be reading the news if that's the reason I'm going to a novel. And we read for pleasure. So I wanted to hold on to that. And also I'd written a very political book last time around. And I wanted to try to write a book that was set in these more intimate spaces.
You've completely nailed it. It's a book that you want to relax into. It's not about I'm getting this political point from it and this and this and this. Even though your novels often examine how the West sees India and how Indians see themselves reflected back, it didn't seem to me that you were conscious of writing across those lenses. But I guess all of those tensions are still interesting to you, but presented to us in a way that delights us.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Or disturbs us, even. Because there's political unease in it, there's migration, there's fear, there's nationalism, as we've talked about. I wonder if your characters are products, or if you see your characters as products of that time, or people just trapped, as indeed we are, in a larger historical weather system.
The secret structure of the book, and this was really helpful when I came upon this idea, is who is trapped by whose gaze, who is in whose purview when it comes to parents and children, when it comes to nations, when it comes to the news, journalism, who's telling the story, where does it come from, when it comes to art, who is the artist, what are they capturing, when it comes to men and women, who has the power. So that, and how, therefore, Sunny and Sonia are also on a journey to locate and tell their own story, which is why I think one is a fiction writer and one is a journalist. Thinking of Marquez, again, writing that journalism and fiction are both two wings of the same bird. So that was a very helpful idea. And at the center of the book is a little painting of a demonic figure, half a demon, half a god, of the kind that you would have found, or I would have seen, up in the mountains in the Himalayas, where I partly grew up. And I remember going with my father, in fact, during one monsoon season, traveling in Sikkim. And it was so rainy, and I'm so glad I saw that landscape then at that moment, with these ancient forests, and you would go to these monasteries that could be quite deserted, and in the midst of all the clouds you would see these demonic figures and you would see dragons. So there's a painting in the book that comes from those ancient forests, but actually exists in my life because it was a present by the artist Francesco Clemente, who's been working in India ever since the 70s, and gave it to me when I wrote an introduction to his exhibition. And I had that little figure in front of my desk while I was working all of these years, for many of these years. And it was interesting to see how painting enters a novel, how painting becomes a book, because with this faceless little demon, his face is a cracked void, I could somehow relate to, go back to Hindu and Buddhist ideas. As one of the characters says, this is to a time when, when Buddhism was older than the Buddha, because it was so close to animism and the natural world. And I could use this figure to construct the story according to who was captured by whose gaze, and also travel historically from that time period into the present, into the museums of the present.
And wonderful to have that linking device all the way through it. You finished the book, obviously. It's out in the world now. I mean, I get the sense you finished it reluctantly. You could still change bits of it, or you'd like to if you could. But you've lived with these characters for 2 decades. So I wonder how it feels to let them go.
Some characters I'm happier to let go than others. There's some very unpleasant ones in the book, and to write them, it's difficult to go to those darker places. And the part of this book takes place in the ordinary light of day, but a lot in the shadow world, in the world of fear, as we spoke about. But I do miss others quite a bit. For example, Sunny's mother, Babita, was a character I loved writing. She's difficult, she's politically incorrect, she's quite racist and greedy. She could gobble the whole world and it would not be enough. But she's a character I adored writing.
What are you going to do with your life now?
I don't know. I mean, it's a good thing I'm on the radio and doing publicity, because otherwise I would be, going a little crazy trying to find a new topic. But I do find that when I wake up in the middle of the night during bouts of insomnia, my mind goes to what should I write next?
And you definitely will write again.
Yes, I don't know how else to live, really. I don't know what else I would do.
Do you feel that in a way you've sacrificed your life or your youth for your art, or has it felt like a wonderful thing to do?
Both. So 2 contradictory things. I do feel in one way that I perhaps was too extreme. I just really vanished, and yet it's a privilege to be able to do so. It's just quite crazy that I've been able to do so. But yes, and I was saying the other day that, I was always terrified on my birthday. And I thought, my gosh, another year's gone by and I haven't finished my book and I'm growing older. And what am I going to do when I'm in, what's going to happen? There's nobody around. I don't even have a dog or a cat. I only have a plant and it's also dying. So it is scary, actually, to have done that. At the same time, how fantastic it's been.
Oh, and how fantastic for us. I mean, we are the beneficiaries of this.
Thank you for saying that.
This book is extraordinary, and I really hope we don't have to wait another 20 years for your next piece.
Thank you for saying that. No, I'm not going to take another 20 years. I don't have the time.
Well, I don't know. I mean, your mum's still writing, right?
She is. She's now 88, and she published Rosarita last year.
Right, so, no excuses. Kiran Desai, thank you so much for speaking to me.
Thank you.
The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny is published by Hamish Hamilton, and it's out now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the production team of Steph Chungu and Daniela Braw-Smith. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.